Let's get started, everyone. It is great to see so many people gathered for such an important discussion this afternoon. So welcome to this afternoon's panel discussion, The Effects of Intimate Partner Violence on Children, presented by Project SAFE and the Atkins Center for Ethics. Before we begin, I have just a few logistical notes about today's program. Do note that we are recording this program, so just keep that in mind if you unmute yourself to ask a question or something like that. Please kindly keep yourself muted when you are not speaking so that everyone can hear the panelists clearly. We will have, the plan today is to have roughly 60 minutes of panel discussion, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. That said, if you have a question before the Q&A time begins, please feel free to post those questions in the chat. Both me and the moderator, Dr. Tunney, will be keeping an eye on that chat throughout, and we might interject those questions, so feel free to leave those there. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible that directly address today's theme. And you are also welcome to share resources or helpful links, but we ask that you use your discretion and good judgment about what you post in the chat. Thanks, everybody. So today's program is sponsored by Project SAFE and the Atkins Center for Ethics. Project SAFE works to prevent domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking, to improve responses to violence experienced by members of our community, and to provide services to meet needs of victims and survivors, both past and present. Project SAFE's goals are to create a culture on campus that will not tolerate violence, that will amplify the voices of victims and survivors, and that will empower survivors. They believe that all members of the university community can play a role in ending domestic and sexual violence. The Atkins Center for Ethics was founded in 2017 through a generous endowment by Michelle and Dr. Pat Atkins. The Atkins Center is committed to bringing ethical reflection to bear on important social issues through teaching, community engagement, and scholarship. Furthermore, it is designed to raise awareness about the importance, complexity, and consequences of incorporating ethics in all that we do throughout our lives and careers. Before we get started, I have the special privilege of introducing our panel of four that we will be hearing from today. So I will begin with Dr. Frances Horton-White. Dr. Horton-White is the Campus Victim Service Coordinator with the Mississippi Coalition Against Sexual Assault. She is a national technical assistance provider for victim services, along with other TA providers, a team member and trainer for the Department of Justice, Office of Violence Against Women, campus grant project programs, providing trainings and technical assistance to colleges and universities on issues related to campus sexual violence. She is certified as a credential advocate with the National Organization for Victim Assistance, licensed professional counselor and clinical supervisor with the Mississippi State Board of Examiners for Licensed Professional Counselors, national certified counselor with the National Board for Certified Counselors, and master addiction counselor with the National Association for Alcoholism and Drug Abuse Counselors. A native of Jackson, Dr. White received her Bachelor of Science, Master of Science, and Doctor of Philosophy from Jackson State University. She also has an associate degree in theology from the St. Timothy Institute. She's developed academic and student support programs in her years of teaching mental health, substance abuse, and advocacy to support the intellectual, social, emotional, and spiritual development of undergraduate, graduate, and professional students. In 2016, while working in the capacity of director of the Latasha Norman Center for Counseling at JSU, she secured the OVW campus grant funding dedicated to providing sexual assault, dating and domestic violence, and stalking prevention education, advocacy, intervention, policy development, coordination, and bystander education. Believing in the importance of service, Dr. White volunteers with the local Rape Crisis Center of Jackson, Mississippi as a victim advocate and crisis counselor. Our next presenter is Siobhan Walker. Siobhan is a CYF IPV specialist through the Women's Center and Shelter of Greater Pittsburgh. She has been an advocate for families experiencing domestic violence for over 5 years. As a CYF IPV specialist, Siobhan facilitates coaching and consultations, training, and personal peer support with Allegheny County Office of Children, Youth, and Families workforce. She also provides psych education about IPV and safety planning strategies to adult survivors and persons who have experienced violence. Lexi Pomeroy is a senior social work student, a peer educator with Project SAFE, and the president of the LGBTQ CU, and has experienced IPV as a child and as an adult, and has undertaken research in that regard. And finally, our moderator this afternoon is Dr. Erin Tunney. Dr. Tunney is the director of Project Safe at Carlow University, a program designed to prevent and respond to intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and stalking. Through this program, she collaborates with local agencies to develop and facilitate prevention programming, facilitate education and training for employees, run the peer education program, and support individuals whose lives have been impacted by domestic or sexual violence. Dr. Tunney collaborates with various departments to improve policies, provide resources, and host community events. They're also the advisor of the LGBTQCU. With 20 years in the field of domestic violence, Dr. Tunney has conducted research, taught classes, and worked as a practitioner supporting individuals who have experienced this harm. Dr. Tunney has worked for a domestic violence shelter in Northern Ireland, supporting women and their children. When they worked for the Women's Center and Shelter, they worked with teens who experienced dating violence or witnessed intimate partner violence in the home. Her research focuses on barriers to accessing services in post-conflict North Ireland and post-apartheid South Africa, transforming militarized masculinities through youth work with young men in Northern Ireland, and the efficacy of bystander intervention programming. Dr. Tunney teaches intimate partner violence, the Women's and Gender Studies Contemplation and Action course, and Girls in American Society for Carlow University. And so finally, with our well-credentialed panel, I pass the mic to Dr. Tunney to moderate our program. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. And I would just like to say that this program wouldn't be possible without the collaboration with Justin Pearl, who is an amazing advocate on behalf of individuals who have experienced intimate partner violence. I also wanted to say before we begin the questions that this information is quite sensitive and can possibly activate trauma for some people. I'm wondering if Siobhan could post the Women's Center and Shelter hotline in the chat so that we can, so that an individual, if you have had a trauma activation, can either text, chat, or phone Women's Center and Shelter to talk about that experience. Okay, so the first question that we would like to talk about is we're going to explore in this panel both the immediate and the long-term impacts of intimate partner violence on children. So let's start with the immediate impact. And we'll start with Frances. In what ways have you seen children impacted in the short term by intimate partner violence?
Thank you so much for the question, Erin, and I'm just grateful to be a part of this wonderful panel discussion. As Justin shared, I'm now the National Technical Assistant Provider for adults and those programs at colleges and universities who are working to reduce sexual violence on their campus. However, in my former life, I worked as a mental health therapist and a licensed counselor, and I worked with the Hope Haven Children Program through Catholic Charities Incorporated. And I also worked with the foster care children who have been removed from the home due to intimate personal violence and also sexual violence. And I have seen in my work with those children, the immediate impact was that they were experiencing a lot of emotional and psychological issues. And they also would have difficulty concentrating, had poor attention span, was having issues in the school system. As their therapist, sometimes I would have to just leave immediately and go to the school because one of my young ladies who is 8 years old, who had been a victim of sexual abuse as well as physical violence, was writing and passing notes to the little boys in the class asking them did they want to have sex with her. And they would pass a note back and he'll say, no, I don't want to have sex with you. And they'll finally report it to the teacher. But she thought this was normal behavior because that was the environment in which she grew up in. And we had to try to educate the teachers as well as the administrators at the school to not to punish her with any disciplinary actions because of the fact she was in therapy, but she was learning to unlearn that behavior. But we have to be just cognizant that those children who are impacted in those homes, that they model the behavior that they see. And again, they suffer from emotional issues, psychological issues. Sometimes I've even experienced, and I'm sure that Siobhan will share this as well, that they urinate in the bed or they use the restroom on themselves as a mean of protecting themselves, because when they would become stressed and the mother would invite the drug dealers over to have sex with the children for her drug habit, they would use the restroom on themselves so to deter the individual from trying to abuse them sexually.
Thank you so much, Frances. Siobhan, would you like to go next?
So in my experience, I've experienced some of the things similar to Frances when it comes to children. One of the things that we notice that immediately is that their safety is compromised and their well-being is compromised. And that can be on a mental level, a psychological level, and emotional level. Some of the things that Frances had described, they can become more protective depending on if there's younger siblings or depending on their birth order and things like that. The family, they can become protective of the survivor. So oftentimes become parentified, oftentimes they externalize aggression, those negative behaviors and things like that. So my response is similar to what Frances had shared about the immediate and short-term impacts.
Thank you. Lexi?
Sorry, it wasn't unmuting. So from my personal experience with the immediate effects that I had presented, some of it I realized in the moment, some of it is looking back, but one of the things that really stood out to me is I was very focused on my siblings' well-being, like right away. So just like how somebody mentioned birth order, I think that's a very important part of this because I'm the oldest. I have two younger sisters. And so my immediate impact of the violence that I experienced wasn't actually focused on myself. It was more focused on, okay, what did my sisters see? What do they need? How are they feeling right now? So I took on that parental role pretty quickly after any of the abuse occurred. And then I would focus on me later. So that was a primary thing for the immediate impact in my experience.
Thank you so much, Lexi. I would just like to add that, and we're going to be talking next about, birth order and other personality types that can impact the immediate aftermath. It is interesting what different roles a person might take in a family system. So one individual might respond by closing their door and doing artwork. And maybe that person may dissociate from what is happening a bit. And maybe they start to have headaches. That can be like that one example. Another, somebody may try to take on the role of peacemaker, or they may feel that there is something that is, that is going on that isn't right, but they can't quite put their finger on it. And so they might internalize that and then feel that they might develop depression and anxiety, and that they might experience a low self-esteem because what their instincts are telling them are very different from what the family systems might be telling them. Another immediate impact could be discord within the family, and not necessarily discord related to the perpetrator. It could mean everybody else in the family that is feeling, that is fighting, except for the perpetrator. We also might see some divided loyalty, this tendency to, this uncertainty among children of how to react to either parent, whether they're the abusive parent or the abused parent. They might be hostile towards the perpetrator, but they might be equally hostile or more hostile towards the victim. Sometimes what I've heard from children that I've worked with have said, you know, I felt that the abused parent could actually, you know, help me. I kind of felt that the abuser was beyond hope. So I was, you know, really mad when I couldn't get help from the abused parent. And then the other role, like Lexi mentioned, taking on this role of parenting and being protective. But one final thing that I'll mention is, you know, one of the common symptoms that relates to PTSD, and that is like a sense of hypervigilance. That lack of safety that Frances mentioned, you know, really can manifest itself in behaviors that, like insomnia, maybe some obsessive compulsive rituals, maybe just being easily startled or being jumpy or on edge. So that hypervigilance can really play a role as it's going on, especially when children are not able to kind of articulate or identify for certain what it is that is really happening. So thank you to all the panelists for your answers to the first question. So the second question is somewhat related. We want to explore the way that different children in the same family may respond differently or have a diverse impact. What factors can contribute to a child's response? I'm wondering if birth order, age, personality, relationship to parents, etc., can form the child's response. And what are some differences in the way children may respond? Frances?
Yes, Siobhan, as well as you and Lexi have sort of touched on that question as well, because it is dependent upon the abuse and the trauma, because each child experiences different interpretations of their trauma or different interpretations of the violence. Some are more resilient. There are children who are more sensitive, like Lexi, wanting to be that older sibling to protect the younger siblings, because if the abuse occurred with her, then it's more than likely that the abuser in the household is going to go and abuse the younger siblings, because for those perpetrators or the alleged perpetrators, they have a certain age of a child they like, pedophilia. You know, once you reach a certain age, then you're no longer attracted to them, and they look for the younger siblings. So, you know, it depends upon their experience and how they view their trauma or view their experience of the violence. In order for children to even be successful in recovering, as I shared with being in the foster care system, you know, it really upset me, because when I started working at Catholic Charities back in 2004, the children had already been in the system for over 8 years. And I'm like, you know, how much freaking therapy can a child get? You know, I was really upset with the system, with Department of Human Service, for keeping the child in that environment of foster care, separated from their families. And like, you know, I think Siobhan shared it as well as Lexi with the younger sibling. I had maybe 4 different families that were 2 siblings to each family, a girl and a little boy. Maybe the boy was 10 and the girl was 8 or 9. And he was one of those overprotected siblings who saw the abuse firsthand. And he would allegedly, when he reported it to me, I could only believe what he shared with me, offer himself to the drug dealers versus them hurting his younger sister. He would take the abuse and engage in the inappropriate behaviors with them, watching pornography with them, so to protect his younger sibling. And he was very sensitive to that, but however, he was also a very angry child. He experienced a lot of anger issues, trust issues. He did not even trust some of the foster parents. I think I had to remove them from the household because one foster parent was more drawn to keeping the little girl and wanting to get rid of the young man, saying that, you know, he was trouble. He's always angry. He's going against the house rules. And, you know, and I had to let them know that that sibling is the only family that child has, that if one child had to be removed, then both of the children was going to be removed. But they also have issues with developing friendships because, you know, I shared that they do have trust issues, but there are healthy ways with a support system that our children can recover from this traumatic experience. But I can't say that there's an immediate recovery because the healing process takes years and years of, yes, therapy, but impactful therapy, not just going through the motion, sitting with children and talking, but you have to engage children in developing healthy coping skills and even moving them to the point where they have to forgive their victim mom who did not know how to take care of them. Yes, they were angry with the mom, but the mom was being abused as well. And we found that out later on through the therapeutic process with us having, you know, parental supervision and watching the interaction of the mom with the children versus the father with the children. And it's a different interaction, and you can tell which one of the parents were the alleged victim. And then you can also tell which one of the parents were the aggressor who was actually selling the children to the drug dealers for the dope. It got to a point where the mom was filing lawsuits against the father, but the father was on the road all the time. And the young man even shared with me that he would mark the calendar in hope that his dad would come home and catch the drug dealers in his household. But again, I know I'm going on, and I'm kind of reflecting back on it. And it hurts me, it broke my heart to see these children struggling to try to survive in a world that they felt had just not been there to protect them or provide them with the safety, because as adults, they depend on their parents.
Thank you so much, Frances. Siobhan?
Yes, well said, Frances, but I'm going to add another little spin to that. It's important to recognize when it isn't a biological parent who is actually the person using violence in a relationship, and that can have a different impact on the children as well. Because, I mean, so another part to that as well is that some of the children could be that person's children, while some of the children cannot be, and that person will target the children that's not necessarily biologically theirs. We work with the family where the victim/survivor had to record her paramour physically maltreating her biological son. It wasn't necessarily his biological son. He never harmed his biological children, but he harmed the children that wasn't his, and in fact ended up murdering one of the children that wasn't his. So that's just some ways how children can experience a domestic intimate partner violence difference within the family dynamic, and vice versa. It could be with, like, you know, the female not being like a biological mother, being a stepmother and things like that, or even children within the foster care system. They're the most vulnerable, and they're the most at risk to be re-traumatized with that abuse. And another thing that I wanted to say when it comes to like exploring like the therapeutic supports a child can get, it's important to maybe help child survivors walk that trauma narrative and not necessarily focus on a mental health narrative. It's important to consider being trauma informed and focus on those traumatic reenactments that they may experience, and those traumatic responses and reactions as well. And that can affect children differently, whether you're an older child and whether you're a younger child. You may have been with your mom or the survivor longer, experienced more of the abuse, whereas the younger children, she may now be in a healthy relationship and they didn't have to go through that journey within their childhood.
Siobhan, I'm just wondering if you can follow up a bit, tell us a bit more about some of these signs that might have been present before this horrible tragedy of this child being murdered, that that may help us understand what might be signs leading up to it.
There may be like discord between the adult and the child. The child may not necessarily want to be around the paramour alone. So you can definitely see the tension. You can see the discomfort that this child may have around this particular adult. I'm just trying to think of other things. Maybe just like this child seeming to get a lot of negative attention from this person that may not be their parent. But like the biggest indicator is someone not necessarily being a biological parent. That's actually one of the questions within our agency that we ask when we're doing like a lethality assessment. Do you have children that is not the abuser? So just within that self, it's a red flag and something to be mindful and pay attention to. They may discipline them different. They may talk to them different. The child may or may not, maybe even make eye contact with them or look at them, or you see any type of affection or any type of connection.
So so what I'm hearing, in addition to the non-biological relationship, is that the fact that is the need to listen to the child and observe how comfortable a child is really feeling around this person, see what their body language is, see if they are frightened, and take notice if that is the case.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Lexi?
So I think the responses from Frances and Siobhan were great. I think all of those are such important parts of this. And to bring a personal perspective to it. So like I said, I have two younger sisters, and they didn't experience any physical abuse because I took that for them. So they have a different story than I do. And a lot of times, actually, they didn't even know what was happening. They only found out until I had told them years later, which is how I wanted it in the moment. I didn't want them to know whether that was right or wrong. I was just a kid, so it is what it is in that regard. But I think the question of how different children in the family experience the abuse is so important, because it is all different. They can see the same things, have the same things happen to them, but each individual child will have a different emotion in the moment. They'll have a different reaction in the moment that sticks with them a different way. So even though my sisters did experience the emotional and verbal abuse, they experienced it in a different way than I did. And part of my experience, I wasn't afraid to argue back about things. So because of that, I was the problem child, and I was the one who really got the most of it to a certain extent. I don't mean that to undermine what my sisters experienced, because what they experienced is completely valid and it should never have happened. I just experienced it in a different way than they did. And like I said, I've talked to my sisters about that now that we're all adults and we're older and everything. I've talked to them about it, and they weren't even aware of some of the things that had been said to me, or the way that I had been physically abused. I think that's an incredibly important aspect when working with families who experience domestic violence. And I do think that far too often it's overlooked, and people do just automatically think, okay, well, all the kids saw this, so they're all in the same mindset. And that's not fair to the children, but it's also not fair to their healing process, that's very, very important when we're talking about these subjects.
Thank you, Lexi. I'd just like to add that, part of the impact of birth order and personality, et cetera, does relate to what the relationship is to the abuser and to the parent to the abuser and to the victim/survivor. And, and the degree to which the abuser may be grooming certain children for certain, responses. So it's not just their independent reaction, it is also shaped by how that relationship kind of goes. I wanted to bring up a case that I had worked with where a woman had left her partner and had gone back with the 5-year-old child to get the child's backpack, and the perpetrator held them in the house against their will, and the perpetrator raped the mother, and the 5-year-old child witnessed all of this. And then there was also an 11-year-old child. And one of the things that really frustrated me about this particular case was that this was in Ireland. So the Irish version of CYF came in and said, it's so important for them to continue to have a relationship with their father. And so the 11-year-old was old enough to try to push it off a little bit, but the 5-year-old wasn't. And so the 5-year-old ended up having contact, regular contact with the person. And that continued, and that continued to kind of normalize that behavior. And then it wasn't until a couple of years later that the 11-year-old was essentially forced by CYF to interact with the father. And eventually, and so this, so I guess my point with this story is that we have like the difference in ages, the differences in what they witness, and who knows what the long-term impact is. The 11-year-old was actually able to exercise agency to say, no, I don't want to have contact, even though that was eventually overruled. But the more a person is able to feel empowered and to feel like they're able to exercise agency, I believe the better the outcome. And so I also just want to, say that it can be very, very dangerous when social services might be involved and have a different ethos on this than, where they just feel that interacting with any parent is better. Interacting with an abusive parent is better than not interacting with the parent at all. And so I think that's something that we need to keep in mind.
And that brings up too with the 11-year-old making the decision that they don't want to see their father, but the younger sibling being forced to. That also brings up the difference in experiences where that 11-year-old might feel really angry and really guilty that they're allowed to get away, but their sibling isn't. And that raises a whole nother part of this that is another, indication of how it impacts children.
Then just to add to that, Erin, with that level of trauma as well, there are certain children who learn to live and adapt to that environment. And, they may experience and start exhibiting superficial type of personalities, superficially being in an environment that they just trying to survive. So, that's their way of adapting to that environment because they don't feel that there's no way out. It becomes dysfunctional. They can be unpredictable. They could either be offensive or defensive. It's certain different types of attitudes they take on because sometimes, you have to, like you say, disassociate yourself from that situation and just become somebody totally different. Even create an imaginary friend for safety reasons. So you have to take into consideration that as well.
And I just want to say really quickly, I think the key word that you said, Francis, was survival. Sometimes it's about survival. It's like, I think for Lexi, like, you were more vocal. You expressed that you didn't agree with what was going on in the home. You didn't like it. And then there were consequences for you, whereas your siblings may have just conformed and accepted the behaviors for them to be safe and survive. So, I commend you for sharing that.
Yes,
that's absolutely. And I mean, my sisters, and they've expressed this to me too, that they were taught to be silent. They were taught to stay quiet, and they were conditioned in that way so they could survive. They were hoping I would stay quiet, and I didn't. And that, changed some of that. But I agree with you completely. Yeah, I think that's a very important part of this.
Yeah, and the final thing that I wanted to add about the particular case that was disturbing to me, and Siobhan, maybe you can shed some light on how it's manifested itself in your work, is that the perpetrator really worked on grooming the children, youth, and families, and so he manufactured evidence of affairs that the victim was having that were proven to be untrue. He also tried to exploit any drinking that the person did, even though her drinking was very mild, and his drinking was not. And so, it's heart-wrenching, I think, to observe the grooming of other institutions to try to win, for the abuser to try to win favor with that institution so that they could have a better outcome.
Absolutely. So yes, I would definitely say the abuser tried to groom, the criminal courts. He tried to groom the child welfare agency. He even tried to influence those systems to believe that the oldest sibling murdered his own sibling, that it wasn't him. So that definitely played his manipulation. He tried to use that as an influence over the systems, but it just didn't work.
And the person that he tried to pin the murder on, was that another non-biological child?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So the two older siblings were the non-biological children of his, and the two younger siblings are his biological children. Mm-hmm. And he murdered the second oldest non-biological sibling and tried to say it was the oldest biological sibling that killed his brother.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So this actually goes right into our next question. In what ways might the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator use children to promote abuse towards their partner? Mm-hmm. And I think maybe we can also tie in what ways might they use systems to promote abuse towards the partner as well. Francis?
Yes, I have to agree with Siobhan about that manipulation. We know intimate partner violence is about that power and that control. And we know that irregardless of them controlling the victim or the survivor themselves, they want to control that entire household. So manipulation is key to them controlling the individual who may decide to leave. It takes a long time for a person to really make a decision that they want to leave that environment. But then the children can be used as a tactic to keep that person within that household and choose not to leave. or they could be manipulative in the way that they are dependent upon their financial situation, economic wise. And if that person who's the perpetrator or the abuser is the sole provider, then the individual has no choice but to stay in that abusive situation because they don't have a job, they don't have resources, they don't have a support system. I've seen a lot of abused women and men who family just have wiped their hands and saying, you know, you're no longer part of the family anymore, because I can't understand why you stay in that crap, why you allow that individual to continue to abuse you and your children over and over again. But they not looking from the inside out, they're looking from the outside in. And it depends upon how that person feels. If they're frightened, the children might comply with whatever wishes that the perpetrator or the abuser asks them to do. It could be harassment. They could even feel intimidated. You know, they can convince themselves that this is what's best for all of us. Because if I'm a good child, or if I behave appropriately, then maybe he won't beat up mama as much as he does, or maybe she won't stab daddy as much as he does, or the partner. You know what I'm saying? They look at surviving in all aspects of the ways that they want to just stay alive. They want to eat, because they'll take food. You don't go in my refrigerator. I had a child even tell me in the foster care system that there was a chain put on the refrigerator after dinner and saying that you do not go in my refrigerator. And this was a foster parent who we had trained to be a foster parent and was receiving funds from Department of Human Services, but were abusing the children, and they was adding on to the abuse that the children was already experiencing. They did not think that the child would report it to me, but the child did report it to me, and we immediately had charges brought against that person. So it's not always the abuser in foster care system. It's the system sometimes that abuses the children and re-traumatize or re-victimize the children, because you put them in homes that you don't vet, or you don't do a background check on those individuals. And I have even seen that foster parents have sexually abused children as well.
Thank you. Siobhan?
So yes, so to add to Francis, I know some children are often put in the middle of fights, and when that, like physical fights, physical altercations, and they can oftentimes be harmed, or become a near fatality or a fatality. I know that maybe some children can be utilized to resolve the conflict, which is not appropriate. One of the pieces of media, we do support groups for mothers and fathers who are experiencing children, youth, and families. And one of the pieces of media that we utilize to display that is the Susan Steele video. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Susan Steele, but she was interviewed by Oprah, and her children were, I would say, coerced to film their father brutally assaulting her on more than one occasion. Even you can even, on one of the videos, you can hear the child in the background, you know, agreeing with dad, aligning with dad, you know, being disrespectful to mom, being condescending to his mom. And, you know, we as the professionals could only think like this child did this to keep themselves safe, to obey, because dad had the most power in the home. So those are just a couple ways that we like to share that from my experience, that I know children are used in intimate partner violence relationships. It could be a person using violence, trying to go down and gain custody, trying to be the first to file those protective orders, to play, they like to play that victim role. And then, you know, we call that systems abuse. So I'll just stop right there.
Lexi?
So two things came to mind when you had asked this question. The first thing that came to mind for me is, in my experience, my mother was the person who was abusive for us. And my father was the one who worked. And he, you know, all the insurance was under his name and everything. And my mom was very physically ill. So one of the ways that she would manipulate us into going on her side is she would, and this was very true, but she would say things along the lines of, you know, if your dad leaves me, I won't have insurance, I won't get health care, I'll die. And that was a very big part of, the argument for us not doing as much. And my sister's not fighting back as much. I knew it was wrong, but I also, as a kid, that made sense, so like she did that well, I guess, because it did make sense, and it did hold me in that way. Another, I forget, I think it was Frances that mentioned it, but one of the things that would also occur in my household is my mom would bring us into it and say, like, didn't you hear him say this, or didn't you see this, or that kind of thing, and put us in the middle of it. I don't want to speak for my sister, so she put me in the middle of it. And so that, I think it's really easy for a perpetrator to use a child for their gain in these situations. And I think often that's another part of it that's overlooked. But for me, I can tell you that I still remember those times very vividly. And I'm sure other children who've experienced that and who've been put in the middle like that also remember the emotions with that, and the uncertainty, but also the fear along with it, and the sadness and anger. I think it's something that when we are given therapy and support systems and everything, it's not brought up as quickly, or maybe not at all, and it should be.
Thank you, Lexi. There are two things that I would like to add in terms of the way in which the perpetrator might use the kids. And one of that is, Frances has talked a lot about sexual abuse, but I also think that I've seen some very subtle forms of sexualization of children that has been done in order to control the children, and in order to and where the victim/survivor is a bit powerless to kind of make any intervene in that. And it's also done subtly enough that it makes everybody in the household question, was that really sexualization? Was that real, or was it not? So it could be something as subtle as making some different comments on a person's outfit, or on the development of a person, or it could be, touches that are kind of unwanted and uncomfortable. And so, so it doesn't, so it can be something that's that can be on the more subtle side. The other thing is, the other way that I've seen this is with the perpetrator making, the children complicit in the abuse. So all of the put downs that the perpetrator might be using for the kids, and all of the that can, the kids can end up, kind of being on the perpetrator's side in a way, because that makes them feel safer, and they might then end up putting down the parent or making derogatory comments towards the parent. The final thing that I wanted to mention, what is the system of abuse that Siobhan was talking about. When I, at the women's shelter in Ireland, I worked primarily with people who had already left abusive relationships and were dealing with child contact and child custody cases. And there are so many different ways that the system can be used to, to be, to help to, to groom, the system. People in the system can be groomed to get the result that they want. And we have to remember that people who are abusive aren't abusive to everyone. They are abusive in the context of their intimate partner relationships, and children may be involved, but that person might be a very nice and congenial and good person that otherwise. And so it's not necessarily something, it's not that school systems might easily see. It's not always going to be somebody that's, looking shady or anything. It might be somebody who's very well composed and who's a very good talker that can really use the systems in their way. So I just wanted to reinforce that. And the final thing about system abuse that I wanted to mention is if a person's abuser is a police officer, that really complicates matters, and that can really contribute to a greater degree of unsafety. And Lexi, I didn't know if you wanted to mention this a little bit.
Yeah, so one of the things I did to prepare for this event is I created a survey and I asked different people about their experiences. It was all anonymous, and I asked different people about their experiences being a child witness of domestic violence. And one of the responses we got that was very important, I thought, was referencing that the abuser was a cop. And I think that opens up a whole door of conversations that we could have about it. One of the most important parts I wanted to bring up is how often we hear of law enforcement being abusers in a family situation, and how often as well that is just pushed away and swept under the rug and it doesn't exist. So I could go off about this for a long time, but for the purposes of time, I'll leave it at that is an incredibly important part to remember, that it can change the child's perspective on who is safe. It can change their perspective on where they can get support from when they're older. They might not have the understanding of, okay, well, I can trust this person because they're an authority figure, or I can't because this is the example I was given. So again, I could talk for a long time about this, but I'll leave it at that.
And that can, especially given that there's more policing in schools as well, that can create a really difficult tension, because the police officers in schools might not be seen as safe people. So I have two more categories of questions, and so I'm just going to ask these two questions, and then we'll move to the Q&A. And so please feel free to put your questions in the chat. So the first question is about the long-term impacts, and the final question is about interventions. So we'll start with Frances again. In what ways do you see the long-term impacts of children who experience IPV in their family? And how does this experience impact an individual's relationships in the future?
Well, it goes right back to some of the immediate impact that it has on children, the emotional, psychological issues, mental health issues, anxiety, depression can lead into adulthood. There are those adult children of abuse who sometimes, again, model what they grew up in because that was normalized. And in their mind, they think this is the way I should live. Children grow up to engage in criminal activity, different things. I've even worked with young children who were self-mutilators, cut themselves because they blamed themselves for the abuse, thinking that as a child and the adult would say things like, you wearing that outfit, what the hell did you think I was supposed to do? You know, you arousing me, and blame the child. And children take on that role of that responsibility and thinking that I'm the reason that that person abused me. Therefore, if I eliminated some of these issues and I became unattractive, then that person would no longer abuse me. But it can have long-term effect in their relationship. They choose unhealthy relationship. Lexi can probably share some experiences from her standpoint that I know you. Sometimes children have lack of self-esteem and lack of self-confidence and not believing that they're good enough. And they're always overcompensating to fit in, whether it's in a social aspect or in a relationship, because I just want somebody to love me. You know, they can also turn to drugs and alcohol, you know, as a scapegoat. Sometimes, you know, using drugs would help me not have to deal with the pain of the experience that I've had growing up and watching my mom or my other siblings being abused. And when we talk about risk-taking behaviors, might be something that they engage in. Some might be in physical fights. You know, I talked about my little foster care children. Some were very aggressive, then some was isolated, very withdrawn, very submissive. And then there was those that, as I shared earlier with the notes to the little boy, very promiscuous type behavior, you know, taking on those type of personalities and attitudes. I wasn't able to continue to follow them as they grew up, but I was able to stay in contact with some of the foster parents that did stay in contact with them. Out of those 4 families with 2 siblings in each family, 3 of the 4 did survive. One family one of the child ended up as an adult going to jail, and then one did engage in drugs and alcohol. But it is about that support system that can help these children to get into good therapy with trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. You know, cognitive behavior therapy is very good, but trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy is excellent for children experiencing that. And then knowing where the support systems are. And, you know, and it's sad to say that not all of us in this field because we have the passion for this work. Some people in the field just to have a job. And those are the ones that should not work with children or adult children of abuse. Those people who should work with individuals who have experienced trauma and have experienced abuse are those who really do care about helping those individuals to recover and to start a healing process. But there are interventions out there, and we'll talk more about that. And I'll pass the mic on so I won't take up all the time.
Siobhan?
So some long-term impacts that I've been able to see is that, you know, some children have challenges with developing healthy social skills. You know, they have challenges building like meaningful relationships. I know some of the children I'm able to observe at our residential program, they have occupational challenges, they have intellectual challenges, they just have challenges with like securing attachments and bonds, trusting other adults, trusting this environment. Others children may normalize the toxic behaviors. They may normalize the abusive behaviors they witnessed in the home. Yeah.
Thank you. Lexi?
So in my experience, I am more aware of the long-term effects that I've had than the short-term, since I was so focused on my sisters. I wasn't as focused on how it was affecting me in the moment. But some of the long-term effects that still to this day, while I am recovered a lot more than I've ever been, they do still come up in different situations. One of the things, and Frances mentioned this, but one of the things that I did when I was getting older in my teenage years and everything is I really gravitated towards a lot of unhealthy relationships. And I was searching for somebody to love me. So anybody who gave me that small ounce of, oh, maybe this person really does like me, I jumped on it and ran with it, whether it was healthy or not. And that actually led me to being in an unhealthy relationship in my later teenage years as well. An abusive relationship. Because of that, I was searching for that love, and I also had been taught that this is how relationships are. So I must be in the right one if this is happening here too. Some of the other long-term effects that were mentioned actually in the survey as well, but I've experienced too, that hypervigilance that we've mentioned, that even to this day, I still struggle with that. And I've still, like, I don't know, I've heard a sound and I've looked immediately, and those, I mean, little things like that, just for safety purposes, I still constantly think, what could happen in this moment to me, and how can I either avoid it, or what can I do when it does happen? I do that in class. I do that at doctor's appointments. I do that when I'm driving alone in a car, things like that impacts me. But also the different mental illnesses have come up. And that's one of the things that was mentioned in the survey. So for one, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I am diagnosed with CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And that was mentioned multiple times in the survey. There's also different obsessive compulsive behaviors that can arise from experiencing abuse as a child that take on when you're later in life, when you're recovering, or when you're in those therapy settings. Oftentimes I've noticed in my research, but also, my personal experience talking to friends, once we start to acknowledge the trauma, once we start to process it and think about it and really sit down and dissect it, these behaviors will arise even more, because it's our body's way of trying to protect us, and there's a threat now, so we need to find a way to stay grounded. And when we grow up in abusive situations, those ways that we choose to stay grounded and that we try to ground ourselves aren't always healthy. And that's when the self-mutilation comes up. That's when these obsessive compulsive behaviors come up. That's when the searching for love and searching for a connection that might not be healthy, but at least it's there. That's when those things arise.
And I just wanted to say one more thing. Lexi, you just had brought a thought to my mind. I think another long-term effect is that the child in the situation may learn to not be able to trust the non-offending party, the non-offending parent, or like the survivor or the victim, and that can have an effect on their relationship. They may feel like I had to leave the comfort of my home, even though the environment wasn't ideal, but not being able to process when we had to flee or abandon that for safety, even though we're not in the most comfortable situation. And that child can internalize or externalize that and just be upset or express anger towards the survivor, not understanding that they're doing what they need to do to keep themselves safe, even though this situation is uncomfortable. So I do believe that has long-term effects on the child with the non-offending parent as well.
Absolutely. And actually, in response to that too, I gave you an idea and you just gave me an idea. We're going back and forth here. It depends on the age of the child, when fleeing occurs and that kind of thing. Because if you have a 7-year-old who had to leave with their mom or their dad, they might have internalized that for 10 years, that my mom took me away from my home. And that sucks. That was my home. I don't have my room. I don't have the clothes I used to have. But if it's somebody who's like 15 fleeing, then they might have, a different level of sadness that person doesn't. And I for me, and in my experience as getting older and realizing these things after it's happened rather than during, I've noticed a lot of that, you know, with my sisters and me having different responses to things. And the way that I've talked about situations with my sisters, they'll say, okay, well, wait, that's not how it was for me. And they have completely different emotions and that kind of thing. So I'd agree with you, Siobhan. I think that was a great point.
Thanks, Lexi.
These are wonderful points. I would just add a couple of other symptoms of PTSD might include panic attacks and chronic pain. Those may be things that can stay with a child for a long time. So finally, I want to bring this back to interventions. What can be done to help kids? And should these interventions vary based on age? What are the best ways to help children? Francis?
Yes, and I would have to say, in my professional opinion, it should vary with age, because as Lexi has pointed out, at different stages and ages of children's life, they experience insight and awareness differently from older children, teenagers and adolescents, who see it for what it is, the abuse and the violence, whereas small and younger children are resilient, true enough, but they internalize it. But my suggestion would be that, you know, they need that consistent routine, you know, they need that consistency in showing and expressing love, irregardless of the behavior and the acting out, because that is part of them surviving and them coping with the situation. Understanding, talking about it, getting the professional help, acknowledging that the trauma occurred. You know, you can't dismiss it. It is a reality, and acknowledging that that is a reality, but being consistent even with your disciplinary process. If you're going to punish your children or take something away from them, be consistent across the board. Don't start getting soft on me and have that little moment where you feel sorry for the kid. You know, I'm experiencing that in my adult life with my one and only granddaughter, you know, and my children have to remind me, Mama, you didn't treat us like that. We would have got a nail tore out our rear end, and you let her get away with murder. But I have to just charge it to, as a grandmother, you get softer with age, you know, but you have to be consistent. And that is absolutely true, because I can't stand it when my daughter is disciplining my granddaughter, even though I was hard on them with helping them to be responsible. But we have to remain consistent, and we also have to share with the children that they are loved, you know, irregardless of the environment. But you are loved irregardless of what mistakes I have made. I have to acknowledge my lack of responsibility in protecting them if I am the victim of that intimate partner violence. And then as we develop support systems, we need to be in partnership with places like the Women's Center. We need to be in partnership with people like Lexi, who her shared experiences can help those young people to thrive and start recovering and be healed. You know, when we talk about cognitive behavior therapy, as well as trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, we're trying to help the young person change their negative thoughts into positive thoughts, and let them know that the negativity don't outweigh the positive. Find ways of celebrating them when they do succeed or they do well in school. You celebrate that, and that would help to encourage and motivate them. But seeking professional help, because this abuse did not just occur on an individual basis, it's a family situation, and the entire family has to be in recovery, and the entire family needs to heal in order for everyone to heal. Because what I shared when I was working as the therapist with my foster children, if those individuals that inflicted or impacted that abuse upon these children, they going right back to that same unhealthy, dysfunctional home environment. The therapy and the work that we've done with them is not going to last long. And when some of the cases, by the grace of God, we were able to get with the social worker who did hear us as the therapist, and we went to court and had that mother's parental rights terminated because she was alleging that the father was the abuser and it was her who was abusing the children. And we were able to observe the behavior because the kids would act out after they would have that parental supervision and visitation with both of the parents. And my suggestion to my supervisor was, we need to split it up. Let's bring the mother in and let the mother visit with the children, and let's wait 2 or 3 weeks later before the father visited with the children. Then that way we will be able to distinguish and identify which one of those parents would trigger those children behavior once they left. And it was the mom. And it was sad, but it was the reality of it with the parent. And so, you know, just being able to have interventions, varied ages, with age appropriate, and seek out those mental health professionals, those advocates, those women's center who are experts in this field and are experts in working with traumatic experiences of those children of abuse.
I just want to underscore a couple of things that Frances said and relate them to the question that's in the chat about how schools can make referrals to mental health services most effectively. First of all, I think, like, in general, one thing that schools can do is be a consistent place for a child. If a child is growing up with this at home, the school can be a consistent place, and the faculty can be supportive external people that a child can begin to feel comfortable making a disclosure to. And so that requires, you know, certain training and expertise to do that. But I think, as Frances said, the mental health services that are referred really need to be IPV informed mental health services. And so, you know, getting in contact with Women's Center and Shelter. Siobhan, I don't know what you would say about this, but and getting, you know, there are some therapists through Women's Center and Shelter. There are child advocates through Women's Center and Shelter. And I think the first thing is to be, collaborating with a domestic violence shelter rather than going kind of rogue and hoping that this random therapist is going to be helpful, because, you know, that I have seen that become a very destructive thing if it's with the wrong therapist. Siobhan?
So yes, I believe, and I'm gonna loop back to what I said earlier, you know, like, keep in mind that this is not necessarily a mental health concern or a mental health barrier, that this is a traumatic experience. And this is definitely rooted in, like, intimate partner violence related trauma. And one of the things that can be done to keep kids safe, like emotionally and physically, is that we kind of have to take it back a little bit and focus on the adults in the situation as well, because I've learned that adult and child safety are inextricably linked. And, you know, at most times the adults are the gatekeeper of safety in the household. So we definitely have to support the adults as well to keep the kids safe, because if the adults are engaging in behaviors that are unhealthy, unsafe, even like dangerous or lethal, that definitely puts the children at risk without a question. And if I had to present any type of intervention for children, it would definitely be to help the family dynamic as a whole reinforce and kind of develop protective factors. And I could name just a few, just as an example, what those protective factors could look like. It could be helping, you know, promote the resiliencies and a growth mindset. It could be helping those families maintain those nurturing social interactions, helping them stay connected to things that, like, within the community, culturally, spiritually, and things like that. And yes, domestic violence organizations can support those families with making that connection. It doesn't necessarily have to be a child welfare issue, but with all means, if there's a safety concern that rises to a level of a child welfare issue, by all means, you can connect a family to them. But I really appreciate, Erin, you stating that connecting with a community resource is oftentimes more helpful to a family than maybe reaching out to child welfare, which can just take it on a whole nother level and divide the family. And oftentimes, survivors don't want to be apart from their partner, but they don't want to be harmed as either. They want to just feel safe and be with their beloved partner and to keep their family together.
Thank you. Yeah. And one thing that came to mind as you were talking is that, one of the dynamics with domestic violence is the isolation that people in the family might end up feeling, and how damaging that can be. And, in my experience, having safe extended family people, extended family networks that are that a child is able to be connected to can also help, whether it's grandparents or aunts or uncles that can, that can actually serve as as role models of healthy relationships, or that can serve as people who help keep the child safe. I feel like that can be helpful. And I think the other thing is some preventive interventions with, like, for instance, what we're about to roll out at Carlow, the campus lab school, are going to be programs for middle schoolers ages grades 6, 7, and 8 to talk about, healthy and unhealthy relationships. And I think having these dialogues really it can be as early as elementary school, can really help the child to kind of process what they may be experiencing and recognizing, well, maybe I shouldn't be normalizing this. Maybe this is outside of the realm of what is safe. And so I think those types of programs can also be really important.
I would agree. Yeah, I would definitely agree, because most times the violence doesn't start in adult relationships. We oftentimes forget that there's teen dating violence that occurs. So I believe that a big piece of prevention is definitely education with our youth and young adults about what's healthy and what's not healthy in relationships. And I really just I look forward to people to continue to be open to have those discussions about teen dating violence as well.
And to add on to that, the Carlow University Campus Climate Survey for 2022 results indicate that 32% of individuals who have already experienced IPV by the time they arrive at Carlow for university. And so this is meaning that it's happening in high school, maybe in middle school. And so we really need to take that seriously and try and work on that early intervention. Lexi.
So I'll be super quick so we have enough time for the Q&A. But in asking if the intervention should vary based on age, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said, that it definitely should. Because when I was 10, I needed different support than I did when I was 17. Because I was experiencing different emotions. I had different understandings of what was happening. There was different situations since I had gotten older and started arguing back and started trying to defend myself. So absolutely, I agree that interventions vary on age, but I do also want to add that there are some general things that are universal no matter what. For example, as it was mentioned, that we need to help these kids know that they are loved and important at any age, in any intervention form that they're in, whether they're 10 or 17, like I had said. It's ideal to make sure they know that somebody's listening to them and it's not being pushed under the rug. It's not something that is just going in one ear and out the other. They're being listened to. They're being heard, because those are two different things. They know that they're loved and important, and whatever's happening at home doesn't change the fact that they're still a human being who deserves to be treated as one. So while interventions, I think, should vary with age, I think that's one of a universal thing that doesn't matter about the age, that should be a main focus in any intervention.
That is a great note to end on, Alexi. Thank you so much for that. So at this point, we only have about 10 minutes, but are there questions? And you can feel free to just unmute yourself and ask a question. If you feel more comfortable raising your hand, you can do so as well.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, hi.
Greetings. I am wondering, I am just now joining the Zoom meeting, and I would really like time to reflect on the conversation. How would I access the recording, please?
So the recording is going to be sent out by Justin. And Justin, are you sending it out to all of the participants, and where else is it going to be available?
Yeah, the recording of this will be available at minimum on the Atkins Center YouTube page. It'll also be in our email blast and stuff, so you can get it through the Atkins Center stuff there. I'll also include a link to it when we do a sort of follow-up questionnaire that we do after events. So you will have a link to it there that'll be available.
And Thank you so much. Oh, excuse me.
Oh, sorry. And we'll also put it on the Project Safe My Carlo page, and we might be able to send it out another way through the Project Safe mailing list.
Great. Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Allison.
Hi. So I know you guys talked about the unhealthy relationships and things that we might see in the school with those children. How would you, or what would you suggest if you're seeing those things and you're having that kind of divide between a student and maybe their peers, and how can you support them as a teacher, especially when you know that it's happening even with you in that relationship? So maybe there's like lying, false impression of what's actually going on in their own situation, just based within the school, and you're trying to be super supportive with them, but you're feeling like it's hard because you know that there's kind of that facade going on.
Who would like to answer first?
I'll give it a shot. You have to understand, if it does appear to be superficial or a facade, that could be a coping mechanism. Mm-hmm. You have to be educated on some of the signs and symptoms that children of abusive homes may exhibit. School counselors, I'm not sure if they have school counselors who have like certification in counseling, or if the school counselor just pushing the pen and doing the curriculums, but school counselors could be very much involved with coming into the classroom and providing some education, or even some of the outside community resources can come into your school during an assembly to provide different types of education on prevention, education of signs and symptoms of children of abuse, or signs and symptoms of things that you need to look for and try to understand. But having a conversation with the child is great. Sometimes you may have to intervene. I know some of the schools may have to get parental consent in order to engage in different type of activities with the child, but then that's something that you should put the parents on notice, and then you can probably be able to differentiate differentiate if it's going on in the household, the abuse is there in the household, and if you need to refer the entire family to a community resource, as Siobhan has said. But you know, by law, push comes to shove, if you see any suspicion of any type of abuse, then it's your ethical legal duty to have to report that, so that the child can have that safety net and be taken away from the home, removed temporarily for that safety reason. But let that be your last resort, because if there are community resources or available individuals who can come in to have those type of hard conversations to help you to be educated on what signs and symptoms to look for, because again, it could be a coping mechanism that that child is experiencing and trying to deal with some of the stresses that they may have. Siobhan, Alex.
I do also want to add to that. One of the things that we're taught in like my social work classes and everything is to really meet that person where they're at. So no matter how much you think I could do this and this and this and just make it all go away, if they're not ready to do that, you can't force them. So I agree with what Frances said about having a conversation with the student and asking them up front, what do you need? You know, what would help you in this moment? And it might be something as simple as just talking to you really helps, or I need you to contact somebody legally. I need to get out of this, you know, and anything in between. But really allowing the student to have the control, because in these situations that control is taken away from them. So the ideal way of responding is to give them that control back.
And I would just add that, you know, like Lexi said, it's very important to, you know, you get on that child's level and you create that safe space. And again, you let them control the narrative and just present to them what you're observing, and maybe just explore what is actually happening, and not so much look for the why in the situation, but to see what's happening and how can you support that child continue to navigate and connect to whatever is needed for that child.
Thanks, ladies.
I would also like to add that I put my email in the chat. As director of Project SAFE, you know, we've mostly been working with the university, but now we're starting to work more in the campus lab school. And so you can feel free to reach out to me, and I can connect you to resources. So, you know, please feel free to do so. And I, you know, just want to underscore the idea that choice is quite important, because so often people experiencing this are deprived of choice. And so giving even very simple things, you know, and I also think that, you know, like there might be something in the class that could be triggering. So, you know, look out for, okay, what's the subject matter? Like I remember, you know, like there were like there, you know, learning about the Holocaust, I found very triggering, that already complicated my PTSD. And so see if there are patterns in the way that a person may be acting out or may be having these unhealthy relationships. And then hopefully through some of these extra interventions that we're going to do in that we'll do in the classroom, that we can, you know, help kids become more equipped with understanding kind of what's healthy and what's unhealthy. And the final thing that I would say is different touch points, because as I think it was Siobhan said, that, you know, they may, or Lexi, they may not be ready to talk now, but they may be ready to talk later. So provide that opportunity at different times and at different junctures, because it, you know, they may close down now, but they may be more open at another time. And, you know, indicating that you are, you know, finding ways to indicate that you are a trauma-informed and safe person for them to go to, I think is really crucial. And finally, it's not always the people that act out that are in the most pain. And so recognizing that it could be that perfect child who comes from the most upper class family that is always put together and whatever, that they may be in as much or more strife as somebody who may be acting out. So
I do want to add real quick, 2 things. I did put my contact information in the chat as well. If anybody has any other questions I could answer, and from a personal experience perspective. And also there was one other question about having a digital resource to provide for the campus lab school. That's a great idea, and I am happy to put something like that together. If anybody has any suggestions, if you are teachers and everything, email me things that you're looking for specifically, but I would be happy to put that together. That's a great idea.
And one thing that we already do have is a Healthy Relationships 101 online module that we can, that is in our LMS, and we can give that to all of the faculty to just kind of go through as a resource. And we do have some resource guides that we can send. And then please feel free to reach out and ask for anything else. And the Lexi and the other peer educators are wonderful and are driven to really helping to put material together that is tailored for the needs of the people that have asked for it. I'd just like to thank the panel for all of your wonderful insights. I think this has just been absolutely wonderful. And so I'm very appreciative to Siobhan and Francis and Lexi.